our earlier discussion of Philippians last week, saw that Paul was looking at his personal situation, talking to the Philippians about his personal situation, especially where he mentioned that some were preaching the gospel for different reasons, out of different motivations. And remember that Paul summarized his thoughts on the matter with, what does it matter? Only that Christ is proclaimed. And now here, in verse 20, Paul continues some of his personal statements, continuing to talk to the Philippians about his own personal thoughts and feelings. My eager expectation and hope is that I will not be ashamed about anything, but that now as always, with all courage, Christ will be highly honored in my body, whether by life or by death. And so here we see Paul's ultimate ambition. In his personal thoughts, he summarizes here for the Philippians his ultimate ambition, that Christ will be highly honored, that he will glorify Christ in whatever he does. And here we see this very important transition he makes, where he says, whether by life or by death, his hope is that Christ will be glorified. And that leads us then to this very famous statement here in verse 21 that many of us have heard before. For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. And so we have to then look a little more deeply. We want to examine this a little further. What does Paul mean by this? What does he mean when he says, for me to live is Christ, and to die is gain? So we see first here in verse 22, he gives us that explanation of what life means, what it means for him to live. For me to live is Christ. And then he goes on and says, now if I live on in the flesh, this means fruitful work for me, and I don't know which one I should choose. So if I live on in the flesh, this means fruitful work for me. So for him, when he says to live is Christ, what he means is to live is this fruitful work. It's to be bound to Christ. It's to be in service to the kingdom. For Paul, life is to be in service of the kingdom. And so here he tells the Philippians, if he lives, if he is released from prison, that life will mean continuing to work in service of Christ and in service of the kingdom, this fruitful work that he has been pursuing. To die then, he says, is to gain. And if we go down to verse 23, he explains a little further. How can dying be gain? That idea is a little contradictory to what our society typically believes, that to die is gain. But he says in 23, I am torn between the two. I long to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. And so here we have this idea of dying and departing, and then he says that to depart is to be with Christ. And so how is dying gain? Well, dying for Paul means being in the presence of Christ. To live means to work for Christ, but to die means to be with Christ, which to Paul, he says, is far better. Far better than fruitful work for Christ here on earth is to be in the presence of Christ eternally. And so here we see, as we're looking at Paul explaining how he feels about these things, we see one of our themes right here. And for to live is Christ and to die is gain, this is one of our themes of the centrality of Christ. That everything that Paul does, no matter what his situation, he is defining by his relationship to Christ. If he is alive, he serves Christ. If he is dead, he is with Christ. Christ is so central in Paul's life that for him to live is Christ and to die is to be with Christ. All things, all situations, in prison, out of it, alive, dead, are defined for Paul by his relationship to Christ. And there's an application point for us here that I want us to notice, where he says here that to live is for me to live is Christ. There's an application point here that I want us to notice right here, that to live is Christ and to die is gain. And the question that we have to ask is, does our faith lead us to feel this way? Does our faith lead us to be able to say the same thing that Paul says here, to live as Christ and to die as gain? For us, for you listening and studying along, is living Christ, or is living Christ plus other things? Is living for you Christ plus money, or Christ plus your career, or Christ plus your possessions, or plus relationships, or plus your family, or plus your hobbies? Is to live Christ, or is to live Christ plus other stuff? And then also for us, or for you, is dying gain for you? And is dying gain for you so much that you long to depart, like Paul says? I long to depart. We know that if we're Christ followers, we know, and we would all say that to die is gain because we do get to be in the presence of Christ. But are we so aware of the fact that death is actually gain for us that we long to depart and be with Christ? Or do we maybe cling a little bit too tightly to the things of this earth and think that what we have here is not something that we are willing to exchange in order to be in the presence of Christ? These are questions that we need to ask ourselves from this text. And then Paul swings the focus back to the Philippians here from 24 on, beginning in verse 23, where it says, I am torn between the two. I long to depart and be with Christ, which is far better, but to remain in the flesh is more necessary for your sake, meaning the Philippians. Since I am persuaded of this, I know that I will remain and continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith, so that because of my coming to you again, your boasting in Christ Jesus may abound. So here in verse 24, he says again to the Philippians that for him to remain or to live, same thing, is more necessary for their sake, for the Philippian church. He longs to depart and considers that to be better, but to remain present in the flesh, he says, is more necessary for them. And we'll call this here our theme of humility, that he is willing to put aside his own desire to depart and be with Christ, so that he may continue to serve the Philippians better. And we see as we go forward that then Paul has three hopes for them, three things that he hopes will occur as a result of his relationship with them, his remaining with them, his continuing to teach and to guide them. Three things that he hopes for. Since I am persuaded of this, that he will remain with them. That's his persuasion. I know that I will remain and continue with all of you for three things. For your progress, for their progress in the faith, and this progress that he hopes for and he encourages in them is really the focus of most of the rest of the letter of Philippians. So first, he hopes for their progress. Second, he hopes for their joy. And here we see another of our themes of joy in Christ, because he does hope that their joy comes from their relationship with Christ, joy in the faith, so that because of my coming to you again, your boasting in Christ may abound. This is the third thing he hopes for them, that their boasting in Christ may abound. Now we understand, we hopefully understand, typically in our culture we think of boasting as a negative thing. It's not a good thing if you are boastful, but here when Paul uses the term boasting, he really means glory. He wants the Philippians to glory in Christ, to give glory to him, and so to use his phrase, to boast about Christ. And so these are the three things that Paul hopes for the Philippians. And another application point for us here are these three things. And the application, I believe, is we should be pursuing and praying for these things in our own lives. Are you pursuing and praying for your own progress in the faith, your own spiritual growth? Are you pursuing and praying for joy in Christ and boasting in Christ, or glorifying Christ? Pastors, are you praying these things for your congregation? Leaders, are you praying these things for your learners, parents, are you praying these things for your children? And I think this is a critical application for us. And a final application I want to point out to you here comes from Tony Merida, professor at Southeastern, and he writes in the Christ-Centered Exposition, to live as Christ and to die as gain. And he says that what we should do is take out these two words here, Christ and gain, and we should put our own words in their places and fill in those blanks for ourselves and ask, for me, to live is what? What is the primary driving force in your life? For me, to live is money, possessions, security, family, relationships, whatever those things may be. And then we have to go and logically fill in the second blank. If for me to live is money, then to die is what? It's to be broke. If for me to live is relationships, then to die is to be alone. If for me to live is possessions, then to die is to have nothing. And you see how this goes. If for me to live is beauty and attraction, then to die is to lose all of that. And we have to realize then from this exercise, there is only one thing in the world that results in gain when we die, and that thing is Christ. Everything else we leave behind when we die. The only thing that results in gain is Christ. And so the final application for us here is, let us strive to be like Paul. Let our lives be fruitful work for Christ, so that we can know that to die at the end of our lives, whether it's sooner or later, is gain.